welcome to the show. I'm delighted to get you here.
Thank you, Alex. I'm really glad to be here.
We were like joking offline, like how small the hospitality industry is, and you just appeared on my LinkedIn, and I was like, oh my God, this person's background is so like impressive. I need to get her on here to talk
Oh, thank
about
you.
HR, talk about talent, recruitment, retention, great places to work. I was like, gotta get these insights on the pod. So I'm delighted we're here.
We're all a few degrees connected in hospitality, so I'm really glad that I surfaced on your LinkedIn somehow.
That's great. It's a great little marketing tool that people are underutilizing. Is the way I would stress that. But yeah, like I say to every guest who comes on the show now, I always like to. I think I kind of had a history of underselling my guests and their credentials and how amazing they were. So, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself? Who you are, what you do, and I think most importantly, how you got to where you are today, Sarah.
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, I consider myself just a lifer in the hospitality industry. So I was not expecting to go into hospitality. Actually, I studied political science in college, had always been kind of very academic my whole life, but something about food and cooking and the community that it creates really jumped out at me, and it kind of became a safe space for me in college. And so I decided to take a chance and go work for Hillstone Restaurant Group right out of college. It was my first job. I had never worked in restaurants before, and I definitely was immediately just addicted to working in the industry. And I think for me, it was always about the diversity of the people that we work with and the total unpredictability of the kinds of issues that popped up that we were trying to navigate every day. I was never bored.
Yeah.
And that was saying something for me. So I really grew my career in operations first, and then transitioned into training in HR with a small restaurant group here in New York City. And actually, after being laid off in late 2016, I was left looking for a new role and interviewing and kind of scrambling to see what was out there, and stumbled upon how many small independent restaurant groups were looking for an HR director, but either didn't have the budget to hire the right level of experience, or frankly, in some cases, didn't even know exactly what they were looking for. And so I started offering my support on a part-time basis to a lot of those groups, and that eventually grew into what is now Empowered Hospitality. So we provide really people function support across the realm of HR and recruiting to restaurant groups of all sizes. We have a growing team of consultants, all of whom are full-time W-2, really dedicated to our purpose, which is creating workplaces where people thrive in hospitality specifically. And it's been an amazing journey. We've worked with hundreds of businesses at this point, and I feel so fortunate to look back and kind of have arrived at this point where we've been able to help so many different people.
That's awesome. And I mean, it's amazing. It's a real kind of story as well, to be in a layoff, which is a kind of galling experience. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Been there, right? It sucks. And
yes.
Wow, it's a reality check for adulthood. You know what I mean? And it's like, I think to be able to say, kind of finding yourself into creating your own company out of it, and really kind of going on a kind of journey here, and empower kind of story. I mean, it's kind of amazing that you kind of found your footing and kind of really dive into your passion about merging it all into hospitality as well. It's very, very, very cool.
Yeah. Well, what's funny about the layoff is you would think it would be easier if you're in HR because you've seen it happen to so many other people, but it was not. I was very freaked out. I was scrambling to find something new. And what I can say now to anyone who has been laid off, as I'm on the other side of the table a lot of the time, is it could be a golden opportunity, and actually having the flexibility to see what's out there and just explore without any strings attached was a really incredible opportunity for me. And I also did not do this by myself. My business partner, then boyfriend, now husband, was in my ear saying, maybe this could be a business. Maybe you could consult. My father had been consulting.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of different data points for me that were pointing me in this direction.
Yeah, that's awesome. But I mean, you still, dipped your toes. You still took the leap of faith to go make it happen and realize that, which is like, unbelievably impressive. So I think it's like, yes, I'm going to hammer home the fact that it's actually very impressive for you. I'm going to cheerlead that. And I mean, Empowered itself, like, is focused on hospitality alone, or is it's hospitality focused sort of HR strategy, people culture strategy? Is that kind of how it helps, and then everything kind of falls under that? Or
the way I describe it is we are like the all-in-one people solution for growing hospitality brands. So that could mean helping with recruiting key positions that maybe a business is struggling with. It could be helping them envision the future from a people strategy perspective, or it could be executing day-to-day HR responsibilities, basically outsourcing things like onboarding, offboarding, payroll processing, benefits, all the stuff that no operator wants to deal with.
Yeah.
We'll take that off of their plate. So our relationships all look very different depending on what the individual business needs.
It's interesting you say that about outsourcing, because I've had people on the podcast talk about that, where like, hiring is just like so difficult, and it's like cumbersome, and it is a real overhead burden. If I like a kind of mental burden, as you will, like if you're getting 100 resumes for one job, someone's got to sit there and sift through those, or like the onboarding process itself, like very difficult in under-resourced businesses, to be able to pay attention. And, I mean, I'm sure you've got all the data in the world to show that if you don't nail the onboarding, they ain't going to last longer than 30 days or 60 days,
right?
And it's like, we know these things, but they still happen, which is why like your businesses like yours exist, I guess, like jumping in like at like, this is a church and state podcast, but let's talk about hiring for a second. Let's talk about recruitment. I never normally talk about Landed on the podcast because I'm like, people are like, he's just shilling Landed. And I'm like, no. I want to hear your perspectives. So tell me about like recruitment again, in hospitality. Because it's kind of like two sides to it. Obviously, you've got your kind of professional management class that exists, and then you have your hourly worker class. And I mean, open any hospitality publication today, NRN or QSR, or any of these sort of like online magazines, and they'll all be like hiring crisis. Like, what are you seeing as a consultant in this space? Like, what do you hear?
Yeah, no, I hear a lot about the hiring crisis, to be honest with you. I mean, growth of the industry has outpaced the number of workers who are available. And so a lot of what I hear is it's not like it was during the pandemic. There are workers around, but finding people who are experienced and qualified is more challenging now than ever before. And in some cases, in some types of businesses, the more casual, maybe counter service concepts, there may actually not be people to fill those jobs, right? We may have to pull them from other industries and really emphasize why working in hospitality provides you with a career path and a lot of opportunities to grow that other industries don't. So, I think, yes, I'm seeing that, and it's real. It's a real crisis. But, there are also plenty of businesses we work with who are actually not struggling to find talent at all. And it's a combination between how they're recruiting and how they're representing their brand and their culture in a way that really attracts people who buy into what they're doing and are bought into sticking around and really seeing through on their commitment. And then also, other businesses who frankly just don't have the same ability to articulate what makes their experience special. They're seeing a very different labor market. They're struggling to find staff. They're struggling to retain people. So, the groups we work with that I would say represent the model of what we should be doing in our industry are those who are articulating their brand really clearly, and then they're following through on that commitment once someone is on board.
It's interesting you say that, because like that's what kind of jumps out at me. What you're saying is like the employee brand, needs to be like vitally managed. Like if you want to like really, I've never used the phrase vitally managed before, but I think just the way I'm hearing it from you is like ultimately, I mean, we hear it all the time, and we're talking about guest experience, great guest experience, but like employee experience seems to me like what you're saying there as well. Like that brand, like if people don't want to work there, they think it's a crap place to work, or they think it's like not a great place for like, benefits. People are not treated the right way. It's such a competitive market for talent. But I find it interesting that you say, well, we have other clients who are absolutely fine and they don't have a problem with hiring. And you put that down to like just them having a great brand, like employee brand, like guest brand, like as in there are certain brands we can think of. Because I have not heard. I did what this might be my 132nd episode, I think, of this podcast now. You're the first person to say to me that there are some brands that don't have a problem hiring. That is honestly, I'm like, whoo. I don't want to say who. You could probably tell me off the record, but it is but it is interesting for me to hear that, because, and it's not because I have a podcast with Landed, which is literally a product to sell to businesses that, are looking to hire hourly workers, which never comes up normally on the pod, but like, I honestly never hear that. Like, I don't like using the word crisis, but my God, like there is just way more jobs than there are people to fill them now. And where are we going to get people from? Like you mentioned other industries, but like where are we going to get them, and why would they come back into hospitality?
Yeah, no, I think there's a reason that the majority of businesses are struggling, right? So I will say it's not easy to effectively recruit and retain employees. And so, yes, the majority of businesses we work with struggle just like everyone else, but there are some bright spots and some amazing examples where they're hitting on all cylinders. It's the branding, it's how they advertise, and their advertisement. It's not just the job postings and the script about the business that you put out on your job board. It's also what employees are saying about you, right? Have you looked at your Glassdoor account recently to see what the chatter is, or Fishbowl, right? There are ways that as employers we can get that little insight into what employees are saying about us in the marketplace. What's your candidate experience like? Are you ghosting people? Are you forming a real relationship with them throughout the process? Are you structured about how you interview, right? Like I've seen one too many hospitality companies that interview, and every interview asks the same questions because we didn't plan in advance. So we're all like, hey, tell me about your background. Tell me about where you've worked before. What's one challenging guest situation you've experienced, and how did you navigate it? So, we can't be that robotic about how we select new employees, because employees are more educated and more knowledgeable now, and they're going to know the difference between a really thoughtful interview process and an interview process where you're just checking boxes and really not digging deeply into someone's experience.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point, because I actually haven't thought about that. Like I feel like when I hear people talk about hiring for hourly workers, it's like, what's their gut check on like whether they're a good fit, and then literally doing a simulation with them, if at all doing a simulation in the restaurant, and getting them in as fast as possible. So like, do they have common sense, and can I get them in? And like that expedition of the process, like kind of runs kind of contrary to what you're just saying there, which is like, no, like you need to have a formal plan for hiring. But it's interesting because, I mean, I guess the best practice for like, what's the Y Combinator's line, like hire slow, fire fast. You know what I mean? It's like be very deliberate, which is awful in and of itself, but being deliberate or intentional about being slow in the hiring process. I guess hospitality is a unique challenge. I mean, do you hear this pushback from some of your clients? Like we have to fill roles. Like we can't open in the morning, we can't do brunch, or we can't do third party if we do not have staff.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a client currently who has their HR director working in the restaurant because they're short a manager. And my mind is blown that that might happen, but it's true, right? You have to operate. And so sometimes you make less than ideal decisions in order to fill a role. That's really where HR comes in, is you want to be strategic and long-term in terms of how you're planning your recruiting, and you want to have a pipeline that's alive and well, not just when you need it, but all the time. So that's how we hire at Empowered. We have a network of incredible candidates that for one reason or another, it wasn't the right time. They needed to build their experience further. There was some reason that it didn't work out, but I can't tell you how many of them come back a year or two later and they end up working with us. And they've been some of our most incredible employees. So fostering that pipeline and those broader relationships is a huge missed opportunity for us, I would say, in our industry.
Interesting. But you did mention as well, in terms of missed opportunity, you mentioned ghosting. And I like how you mentioned that phrase, because first of all, I like how that phrase has permeated the workplace now.
It's a hot topic.
But I did a webinar 2 years ago on ghosting. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like I've never stopped talking about ghosting in interviews.
Yeah.
But tell me, okay, like, it's so hot a problem. I mean, it's been hot like since COVID. Like, what do you think best practices for avoiding that are?
Yeah, I think it's really all about communication and connection. And part of that is building connection between candidates and your brand and your business. So, are you telling enough about what makes you different for them to feel genuinely excited and to stay engaged with you? And on the flip side, how respectful are you being of them and their time? Right? If you're not responsive, if you're not updating them regularly with status, why would you expect the same from them in return? So to me, there are a lot of moving parts, but those are really the two biggest ones that we see. And we do a lot of open calls with the restaurant groups we support. So we'll come in and for a single day, we'll hire 50 new employees through a hiring event. And what makes that successful is it's the day of, sure, execution, showing genuine hospitality to those candidates, but it's also what's leading up to that. How are you reaching out? Are you reminding them? Are you having a meaningful conversation with them before they get there on the day of? And then are you remembering their name and kind of having that full circle moment with them? It goes back to what you said before. It's showing your employees the same hospitality that we are so concerned about showing to our guests, and just bringing that same philosophy full circle.
Doesn't it sound so simple? Like, community. This is what blows my mind. I'm like, I don't know if I've been spoiled my whole life, that I've not had to like be in these kinds of environments, or now that I am, that I'm like, oh wow, like it is like appalling. You know what I mean? Like, even like one of the things that we always talk about is like kids are not using email really anymore, and like you're sending these people email and they're never going to see it. So like, when are they going to show up? Or it's like, this is their first job, so they're not like used to like calendar invites and all this kind of stuff. So they got to think like, how clear. Like, it's not so. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's but
it's not. That's the thing. And like, this is, I think, what's so valuable with our team and what we've seen is coming from operations. We know it's not easy. It's not. I remember being a manager and having a line of people to interview, and I also had a guest issue I had to deal with, and I had a high ticket time that I had to deal with in Expo, and it's like, spending the time to thoughtfully interview someone it's a luxury sometimes.
That's exactly it. Like, you've nailed it with that word there. Like, I think ultimately, like, a lot is asked to the GM, a lot is asked in particular the GM to like deal with that. Like, you got to deal with service, you got to interview, there could be any number of things that are happening along with, say, someone rocking up to the restaurant, and you got to interview that person. And when I think about that, like, it's like, how do you alleviate the burden as much as possible from the GM? And that really is like a leadership question on designing an appropriate process for managing it. And I guess, like, do you get clients that come in because it's like, would you say like the kind of problem would be the problem that you would identify is that a lot of just the hiring is very ad hoc, and it's like almost like kind of like the process of hiring is like ad hoc. It's like everything else from an operation perspective seems locked down, but the hiring is like,
yeah, it can be reactive. And actually, I love that analogy, because if you think about it, we have steps of service, right? Like, the guest sits down, they need to be greeted, they need to have water delivered to the table within a certain amount of time. We're so meticulous about the steps that go into serving a guest. If we brought that same philosophy just a little bit into our recruiting process, it would alleviate a lot of the issues. Because I think, to your point, sometimes the interview process itself is inconsistent. So, one candidate meets 5 people, one candidate meets 2 people, and somehow you're supposed to compare those 2 candidates like it's apples to apples. So I do think that the structure and the thoughtfulness behind the interview process is that initial legwork. We'll often do that with our clients, establish the framework. That will save you time and a lot of headache when you're actually going through the interviews and having to make objective decisions about candidates. You said before, using your gut, right? Like, make your gut decision about a candidate. And, we know in HR, gut is very often driven by bias,
yes,
which is normal. It's a normal human kind of adaptation to process the world around us. But frankly, if you leave your hiring decisions up to your gut, how often are those decisions going to be quality, right? How often do you really know about the candidate enough to make an educated decision? Not very often, I would argue.
Yeah, and I mean, it's born out of data. I mean, we're doing lots of like hiring research on this kind of stuff. And I mean, obviously I'm kind of pouring through all the McKinsey and BCG reports on like, interviewing processes, workplace processes, this kind of stuff. And I mean, the data is just like unbelievable. And part of me thinks like, when it comes to this designing, it just comes down to the designing process. Like, it's the worst thing about like letting kind of gut take over, like gut instinct take over in the hiring process, is, to your exact point, is just like, why rely on a type of bias for like hiring somebody? I mean, like, this is the thing. It's like, it blows my mind. Like, I have this conversation with so many people when it comes to like, these sort of inherent structural biases that exist. Like, why is entry-level positions for women in hospitality 49% of the size of the workforce, but when you get to leadership, it's like 23% or something? You know what I mean? It's like, there's obviously something happening in the sort of promotionable space of women in the workplace. And you're like, the data doesn't lie. Like, whether you agree with like the sentiment or not, like, the data doesn't lie. And so when I hear hiring processes like have a sort of like gut program to them or gut feel, I'm like, come on, man, like, it's not that difficult to just design the program to like accurately interview people in a way, you know what I mean? Like, because I don't know, I'm a believer in access, and I'm like, when it comes to like opportunity, it's like, just because you don't come from the same background or same whatever, like, that is inside you, whether you want to kind of believe it or not. It's like almost like unconscious, like, or subconscious rather.
No, and you talk about the shortage of talent, right? We're working with a program here in New York City that's called First Course, and it's basically taking underprivileged New Yorkers who wouldn't have access to culinary education and putting them through a short program that basically teaches them the skills they need to function in the kitchen. And we've placed almost 100 apprentices successfully in high-end restaurants in New York. That's a demographic that these businesses might not have tapped into.
Totally.
And you are screening out people who could potentially be very dedicated employees and very passionate and loyal to your business. So I agree with you in general, opening up our frame of reference and our frame of mind to welcome demographics that we might not traditionally look to as employees to come into our workplace And, then the onus is on the employer to think about like what happens once they're there too. How are they being supported? Are we creating a truly inclusive space where people who don't all look the same can feel safe and can function and can be supported and grow? That's the other side of the coin, obviously. And, that's where it becomes a little more complicated.
Totally. And I mean, I guess, baby steps into that then is like, given how difficult it is to hire. I don't know if I like using the phrase crisis, but like it is. I mean, it's just like, there's crises all over the world. And I feel like this is maybe overusing the word. But one of the kind of the green shoots of hope that I see is because the challenge is so mighty when it comes to hiring in hospitality, that like we've seen a rebirth in sort of retention focus of staff. Like where I guess the common perception in hospitality before was like you could churn staff, whatever, there's going to be more people would show up, and it's like not anymore. And so restaurants, hotels, whichever, anyone in the space have now had to like rethink their whole policy of like how to retain the staff that they get, given that it's like so difficult to hire them and so expensive to hire them in the first place. When it comes to like retention, I mean, what do you hear are like sort of like the biggest challenges with retaining staff in hospitality today? I mean, they might seem obvious, but I want to know what they are.
I mean, I hear a lot of things, whether they're true or not, right? I hear that people are mercenaries. They're jumping from one job to another for $1 an hour more. There's certainly a lot of that. There was more of that just post-pandemic, so it's gotten a little bit better. I've heard employees are entitled, and from that, I understand it to mean that employees are more empowered now than they've ever been before. We had some very significant social movements that we lived through during the pandemic. Me Too, which obviously predated that. Black Lives Matter. There were larger societal events that kind of raised people's attention to their rights and the power that they have to ask for what they need. And we saw a huge shift in cultures within the businesses we work with post-pandemic, where like for the first time, employees were speaking up for themselves in a really positive way. Maybe here and there you had people asking for more money and maybe they didn't go about it the right way, but more often than not, it was people coming forward and complaining about something that was actually a really big problem. And so, I do think that has leveled the playing field a little bit in terms of historically employers had the upper hand. There was a line of staff out the door kind of waiting for backup if you had someone who didn't work out. It's not the case anymore. And so, I think that's been a very positive shift from my perspective is our clients are asking us about benefits. They're asking us about doing more for their team. What can I do to treat our employees well and give them something that they're not going to get somewhere else? That's a shift and a very positive one from my perspective.
Oh, I mean, totally. That there's like this sort of industry-wide recognition that we need to do more for our staff. Like if we want to keep them, like there's ample choice out there for them. I guess, what are the main things that restaurants, hospitality business can do to retain staff? Like if you were to say, they were like, we need you to come in, we need you to SWAT team in here, or what do we do that we got to stand up tomorrow? What would be that? What's on your dream wish list of things to do?
From my perspective, this breaks into two categories. There's kind of like minimum, here's what you need to make a solid and reliable workplace for your team. And then there's how can you go above and beyond and really differentiate yourself in the marketplace. So the basic stuff, which is always the most important, is compensation. It's work-life balance, which in our industry, to me, refers a lot to predictable scheduling, or just like, I want to know when I'm going to work next week so I can make plans with my family. That's a big example of having the bare minimum things, having accurate payroll. right? Like you're not being mispaid and your tips are being distributed to the wrong people. That's huge. Sense of safety in your workplace. So I know who to go to if I have a concern or complaint. I'm not being harassed. I'm not being discriminated against. Those are all the basics. If you have not done those things, you have not passed go. Then you have, okay, how do I layer on top? I'm already doing the basics. How do I build an even better culture and create a workplace that feels really distinct and different? And, we've gotten more questions in the past 5 years about benefits, implementing benefits. So I would say that's in the forefront of employers' minds, and something that employees didn't expect pre-pandemic, but they've come to expect now, and have a heightened awareness, frankly, of what happens when they're seriously ill because of the pandemic. But aside from that, which I think is very much a moment in time, learning and growth opportunities are always in the forefront. The quality of your managers. So are you being both treated respectfully and managed in a way that feels fair and just and respectful? And also, do you have a manager who cares about your development and your growth? Those are really big things, especially with Gen Z, that we're seeing more and more at the center of the conversation, which, Gen Z aside, I would say younger people coming into the workforce are always looking for that. I remember my first job. I wanted to, be in a company where I knew I could get promoted, and if I worked hard, I could grow. And that's what, that generation is really looking for.
Yeah, I was going to make a joke. I was like, yeah, the financial crisis really did us in there. Millennials. Okay, so some of the things you mentioned there, which I thought were interesting. You mentioned learning and growth, okay, which I thought was interesting, that it was like not the first, the second, or the third one you mentioned in terms of like things we can do there. When I talk to people on the pod, like, everyone's talking to me about like, their leadership, training, mentorship, career guidance. And my take was that would have been like almost like preeminent. Like it was like the one, like nailing down that program. Do you not think it's like, I guess I asked you in the sense that like, if you could start tomorrow, I mean, I guess a leadership program tomorrow is not really going to pay off. It'll pay off in a while. But like, that sort of like learning and development sort of investment is one of those kind of like hard to describe, but when you see it kind of effects. But I feel there's a real appetite for that. Like, do you feel like you get that from people? Do you like, as you're with Empowered, do you guys create programs for learning for like staff, or, I guess I'm trying to figure out a way how to even ask this question.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's always an element of teaching and development in what we do. And I think that's part of what makes our relationship with our clients a little bit different from any other kind of outsourcing firm. Is, empowered. We want to empower the managers that we support to better own their own teams and better support the growth of their own teams. So there's an element of learning and development in what we do and how we support our clients that is very important. It's funny because the reason I didn't mention it first is we come in, and no matter the size of the business, there are always very basic things they're not doing right. And that's not to knock any, I mean, we work with incredible clients in some of the, preeminent restaurant groups in New York City and across the country who are very impressive in every possible way. But, what that is to say is there are these opportunities to do the basics really well. That it means a lot more to your employees than you might realize. But then in terms of layering on top of that, learning and development absolutely is very important, especially when you're scaling. So if you're a single unit and you're the owner and you're there every day and you're personally teaching and developing everyone, it's not as much of a pain point for you. And that can actually be a great selling point for your potential employees, that they're going to get that hands-on development and nurturing from from you, the person who came up with this concept in the first place. But the bigger you get, the more that philosophy has to live outside of you as the owner. And it's that transition that can be very painful. And that I would say the timing of that transition of kind of building the culture and building the learning environment outside of yourself, it almost always happens too late. So, it's a big differentiator for larger groups that have learned to do that effectively. And the culture and the learning, it's a living being in and of itself that doesn't depend on one person to execute.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I mean, like that's like the entrepreneurial mindset, it's like I do everything. I am involved in everything until literally I cannot do anymore. You know what I mean? And then that's usually to your point about like when it's too late, i.e. something breaks, and there are leading indicators and there are like actual indicators that are like why certain things break. And like, I guess, it's like a hospitality business is just an intense environment. You know what I mean? Like, at the end of the day, like you're only as good as your last meal. You're only as good as the last like stay you have in the hotel. They do 9 times out of 10 is great, and 1 is bad. Consumers will tend to remember the one kind of bad experience. And I guess, when it comes to that experience, then with like, the staff themselves, and you mentioned benefits, like these are all new things, or not new things, but like I've had people tell me about doing 401k matches after like hourly staff were there like a month. I had somebody tell me that pet insurance was the hottest thing in this company and people were obsessed with the pet insurance. And like, these are all like additional costs. But I guess, and this is, I'd love for you to kind of add some color to this, is like, how do we get people across the mindset that people are cost? Like hiring is framed as a cost. And it's like, well, if you invest into say like pet insurance and it keeps staff X longer, then you will like lower your cost for hiring because you won't need to hire as many people. And I think people kind of don't get their head around that sort of equation.
Oh, yeah. No,
a kind of statement question.
Yeah, no, I mean, in hospitality, yes, I see people looking at, their team as a cost center. And like in reality, in my mind, because I've seen it work the opposite way, where you have a thriving team and a thriving culture, and they drive revenue. They drive profitability. Engagement has a proven link to business performance. So, like truly, and look, you could look at HR as a cost center too. It goes along those same lines. But what will happen, and you mentioned this with learning and development, is 2, 3, 4 years down the road when you've grown and you're multi-unit and you're trying to get to that point of liftoff where it's not just you carrying the whole team. You have bought-in leaders who are living the dream with you. Yeah. That's the moment where it all falls apart because you haven't invested in bringing them along with you, in sharing the success of the business with them, literally and financially, right? And that I think is the concern around learning and development specifically. You get to a point where you say, what's our internal succession plan?
Yeah.
You don't have a
bench.
Pipeline.
Yeah. And that's the thing, and I like that, the internal pipeline, it blows my mind that I hear that that's a struggle, because it's like, okay, well, there are ample ways to fix this. You know what I mean? Like there's ample different kind of tweaks and triggers that you can do to like improve that. And it's like, I don't know, it makes me bullish, but it also makes me sad and depressed when I think about it. I'm like, oh my God, like, come on, everyone. But then at the same time, I know the devil's in the detail, like I know that it's not as simple, but like at the same time, I mean, like, I guess like I take positives out of hearing that and go, you know what, like for businesses that are probably struggling with that it's like, it's not the end of the world. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, it could be the end of the business, obviously, but like, I mean, in the sense that like there's ample resource, information online, ways to learn how to fix like your retention, your churn, you know what I mean? Turnover. Like there's just so much there that they can do.
Yeah, it's not simple because there are a lot of different levers to pull, but each individual lever is simple. I think that's the beauty of it is showing up to pre-shift every day and having a meaningful conversation with your team, that's one lever. If you can check that box, if you can make sure that you're doing that consistently and getting that face time with your team, that will make a difference. And there are 100 other small levers like that you can pull to increase your retention, your employee satisfaction. Many of them are free. And, to me, it's like, we talk a lot about medical benefits. It's, $1,000 a month to get a medical plan for an employee in New York City. There are plenty of low or no cost options that will mean potentially just as much to your team. So, we talk about that in HR. It's not just one thing. I can set up a medical benefits plan for you, no problem. But if you're not doing all the other little bits and pieces, it's not going to move the needle for you. We have to look at the big picture and all the various different moving parts of the employee experience.
And speaking of employee experience, who's got a great employee experiences?
That was a good segue.
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually not bad at this. So who knew? No. But it's true. I mean, there's tons of stats on your website, which is great. I do love that. I love social proof. But I mean, ultimately, you being certified is a great place to work. And it says here in 2023, after 7 years building your culture. So it took 7 years to get to that kind of like stamp of approval. And that must have been a lot of hard work, a lot of like tweaking benefits, like tweaking which levers, to pull what triggers. Like, so tell me, walk me through like that. Like, was that like a goal that you guys had? Like, from like, we want to be certified great place to work, or like, how did it kind of come? Like, you want to validate yourself,
We're not generally into certifications in and of themselves. But what I will say is when we hired our first employee, for me, that was such a game changer, because Growing Empowered became both about serving our clients and building a workplace that provided really incredible jobs for HR professionals.
Yeah.
And in our industry, a lot of HR professionals are standalone. I was alone running my department for a couple of years before I was authorized to hire someone to help me. And a lot of people on our team come from the same background. So having a community of people to learn from and collaborate with, and frankly, having an opportunity to step outside of the day-to-day chaos of the restaurant environment and truly advise and pause and be thoughtful about the work we're doing. That was always like a driving part of our mission at Empowered. And our mission statement is to create workplaces where people thrive, but it's not just for our clients, it's for our team as well. And just like we were talking about, we believe if we have that culture, that will translate to the cultures that we're building for our clients.
Yeah. I mean, that's so awesome. I mean, first and foremost, I mean, I like exactly that. Like, I mean, your clients are coming to you for the inspiration, how to solve like the challenges and the problems that they face in their own org. And I mean, yeah, like certifications, you know what I mean? It's like, we're not hunting them down, but I mean, it is great validation to know that when, people, prospects are looking at evaluating options like you, that's like, yeah, actually they've also been voted this. So like, they must know something, and it's interesting, cause like you said a really good stat, which I thought was interesting. And I do think that like, it is a great metric to measure, which is like, how many of your employees say it's a great place to work? Like you talked earlier about like Glassdoor reviews or Fishbowl. I have not thought about Fishbowl in like the longest time. Takes me back.
But
it's such a blast. But like 86% of your employees say they have a great place to work, and it's 57% nationally. So like you're absolutely over indexing. And so it's not an easy business to be in. You know what I mean? Like it's a service business. It's like engagement. I mean, presumably it's like retainers and like, but like an engagement kind of programs, like ad hoc engagements, whichever. I used to work consulting myself. So like, it's like, You know what I mean? It's like, it's
It
very
can be
pressurized. It's
challenging. Yeah,
challenging,
there's a
and
lot going on.
you have to over deliver for clients every time. You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing. Like, you have to like
Yeah, it's
give
a lot
them the
of
best
pressure.
experience ever. So it's amazing to hear your stuff, because having been in kind of consulting myself, technically it was design consulting, so like not necessarily the same, but we did organization design, intelligence theory, and change. So like, I mean, I guess something similar to you. And although they never put me in that kind of a room, frankly. But like, when I think about it, it's like, it's very difficult, because ultimately, you got to sell them on like a vision, and you got to take people on a journey here. And results, it's not like a direct response sort of campaign you can just stand up. It's like, it takes time to build great culture, to build great processes, not only for your clients, but 7 years for you getting your certification. Like, these things take time, and it's like amazing to hear about you like building out the culture there, and it speaks volumes to your leadership, because frankly, if 86% of your staff say that they call it a great place to work, I mean, that is like an enormous achievement. You know what I mean? Like, that's like
Well, I
pretty well.
appreciate that. And, look, the one thing I would say is it's actually pretty simple, and it has nothing to do with me and my partner. It's listening to your team. And we've been doing monthly pulse surveys for years. We do biannual employee engagement surveys, and we are happiest when we have a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
We just went through it and presented our results to the whole team, and there were 15 items on there that the team felt we could do better. Like, that is what we're grateful for, because the moment your team stops telling you what you can do differently, you know that you've lost the opportunity to build a really great workplace. If you keep listening to them, and what they want and need is going to change. I remember when we had no benefits at Empowered. In the beginning, we had no benefits at all. And now we have great benefits, and worked really hard to implement. And still this time, people said, we wish you contributed more. And it's like, all right, that's humbling, because we know the work it took to get to that point, but it's valid, because we're hiring different people now than we did 7 years ago. So it's like continuing to listen and take that feedback seriously and action that feedback. I think anyone could get to the point where they could achieve that certification.
That's awesome. I mean, I think we need to do that. I feel inspired now.
You with that.
Yeah. Like, I keep getting emails for like Inc. 5000. I'm like, guys, leave me alone. Come on. I know it needs to work here. One of 5,000. Thank you. I want to be number one or nothing. But here, I mean, this has been a phenomenally interesting conversation. It's been 47 minutes.
Time flies when you're having fun.
I appreciate that. And I mean, look, you've been incredibly insightful. There's been so many nuggets here for recruitment, so many nuggets for great culture, so many nuggets for talking about like retention. I guess if you were to add, summarize, your kind of thought process here on this call today, like what would be your words of advice for hospitality leaders listening to this pod?
Oh gosh. I mean, look, I would say just take it one step at a time. We tend to look at, you can't eat an elephant all at once, right? So we tend to look at the big picture and say, oh, I want to be a great place to work. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to roll out all these benefits. And the reality is, you have to do it like we did. You have to do it one step at a time, one improvement at a time, one employee survey at a time, and eventually you'll get there. But it's not something that happens overnight. And, culture is a very fluid living thing. So you might achieve a point where you feel like your culture is great and your employees are happy, and then a year in the future, you've lost it again. And we read a lot of stories about that, of, growing brands that were known for their culture, and they're not known for it 5 or 10 years later.
Yeah.
They lost that spark. So I think that's the key, if anything, is just really listening to your team and understand that it's a continual process. You're not going to reach an end point and say, we made it, we're now the perfect workplace forever into the future. It doesn't work that way, because employees change.
Yeah. That, I mean, yeah, employees change. I mean, Gen Z. I mean, do a whole episode on Gen Z. Or millennials' relationship with Gen Z, rather, I should say.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I know. I'm managing them now. But here, Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you here. Thank you so much for making the time to come on the pod. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Alex. This was a lot of fun.